Well, hello there. I'm Miss Brennan, and today we're going to be diving into Unit 7 Global Conflicts. We'll be looking at the start of World War I and how it happened, the Great Depression and new technology, and then World War II. Our first podcast is going to be about the changing shifts in the balance of power and what caused World War I. So sit back, remember to document any questions you have, and get ready to learn. All right, guys, our first topic is 7.1, the shifting power after 1900. So, a couple of things we'll be looking at are the factors that led to state formation and expansion, as well as the different tactics and policies governments used to maintain order. We'll be looking at how the West dominated the global political system. We'll be looking at the downfall of older empires such as the Ottomans, Russian, and the Qing, how they collapsed, why, both internal and external. And then we'll be looking at states around the world that challenged the existing social order. So, first, let's talk about social Darwinism. This is a concept that we've looked at before, but it's incredibly relevant to the rise of nationalism. After the Franco-Prussian War, all politicians tried to manipulate public opinion to bolster their governments by using the press and public education to foster nationalistic loyalties. In many countries, the dominant group used nationalism to justify the imposition of its language, religion, or customs on minority populations. And an example would be the attempts of Russia to Russify its incredibly diverse ethnic populations. Herbert Spencer and other people took up Charles Darwin's ideas of natural selection and survival of the fittest and applied them to human societies in order to justify European conquest of foreign nations and the social and gender hierarchies of Western society. The forces of nationalism weakened Russia and Austria-Hungary. Austria had alienated its Slavic-speaking minorities by renaming itself the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And the empire offended Russia by attempting to dominate the Balkans regions. Ethnic diversity also contributed to the instability in Russia. Attempts to foster Russian nationalism and to impose the Russian language on a very diverse population proved to be divisive. Periodic attacks, or pogroms, against Russian Jews also continued at the end of the 19th century. In 1861, Tsar Alexander II emancipated the peasants from serfdom. But he did so in such a way that it only turned them into communal farmers with few skills and little capital. Tsar Alexander III and Nicholas II opposed all forms of social change. Russian industrialization was carried out by the state. Thus, the middle class remained weak and small, while the landowning aristocracy dominated the court and administration. Defeat in the Russo-Japanese War from 1904 to 1905 and the Revolution of 1905 demonstrated Russia's weakness and caused Tsar Nicholas to introduce a constitution and a parliament called the Duma. But he soon reverted to the traditional disposition of his forefathers. The Revolution of 1905 was also called Bloody Sunday. In Russia, well on its way to losing a war against Japan in the Far East, Tsarist Russia was racked with internal discontent that finally exploded into violence in St. Petersburg. It would become known as the Bloody Sunday Massacre. January 22nd, 1905, a group of workers led by a radical priest, Gregory Gapon, marched to the Tsar's Winter Palace in St. Petersburg. Making their demands, they were met by imperial forces who then opened fire on the demonstrators, killing and wounding hundreds of people. In response, strikes and riots broke out throughout the country in outrage to this massacre. Nicholas responded by promising the formation of a series of representative assemblies, again, the Dumas, to work towards reform. The March Revolution. So in Russia, it's called the February Revolution, known because of the use of the Julian calendar. And this began in 1917 when riots and strikes over the scarcity of food erupted in Petrograd, now St. Petersburg. On March 8th, 1917, demonstrators clamoring for bread took to the streets in the Russian capital. Supported by 90,000 men and women on strike, the protesters clashed with police and refused to leave. On March 10th, the strike spread among Petrograd's workers, and irate mobs of workers destroyed police stations. Several factories elected deputies to the Petrograd Soviet, also called the Council of Workers, following the model design during the Revolution of 1905. On March 11th, the troops of Petrograd Army Garrison were called out to stop the uprising. In some encounters, regiments opened fire, killing demonstrators, but the protesters kept to the streets and the troops began to waver. That day, Nicholas again dissolved the Dumas. When the frustrated Russian army at Petrograd unexpectedly switched their sides to support the demonstrators, the imperial government was forced to resign and a provisional government was established. 3 days later, Nicholas formally abdicated his throne, effectively ending nearly 4 centuries of Tsarist rule in Russia. Alexander Kerensky became the provisional leader of Russia. And he came to power after the March Revolution with the goal of turning Russia into a republic. But unfortunately, 1917, this is during World War I. The economy was in turmoil, and Kerensky made a deal with France to stay in the war in exchange for a loan. The Russian economy was at a severe risk of collapsing, but when the public heard about this, they exploded with rage, and he was overthrown 8 months later in the October Revolution. And finally, the October Revolution was the aftermath of the March Revolution. The power was shared between the weak provisional government and the Petrograd Soviet. But on November 6th and 7th, or October 24th and 25th on the Julian calendar, leftist revolutionaries led by the Bolshevik Party and their leader, Vladimir Lenin, who would become leader of the Communist Party, launched a nearly bloodless coup against the provisional government. The Bolsheviks and their allies occupied government buildings and other strategic locations in Petrograd, and soon formed a new government with Lenin at its head. Lenin had been exiled from Russia, but returned in 1917 with the help and support of the German government. The Germans wanted him to cause a revolution that would take Russia out of the war, and Russia withdrew from World War I in the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. With the collapse of Russia, by late 1916, the large but incompetently led and poorly equipped Russian army had experienced numerous defeats during World War I, and they had actually run out of ammunition and other essential supplies. Both food and fuel shortages in the winter of 1916 to 1917 left the economy in a state of collapse. In addition, soldiers were given guns, but no ammunition. And when they complained, they were told, when somebody dies, take their ammunition. The Tsar, Nicholas II, took over the command of the army in 1915, but it was a disaster. A military uprising forced him to abdicate, and he looted the treasury so he could return to power. This would lead to his overthrowing and then the establishment of the provisional government. But what is going to happen to the royal family is a subject that we need to discuss. So the assassination of the royal family by the Bolshevik Party, as well as the assassination of Grigory Rasputin. And we will discuss that more in class. The Bolsheviks called themselves the Communist Party. The communists also had to face counter-revolutionaries from the aristocracy and the military. By 1921, Lenin was in control of the counter-revolutionaries and the country. The communists also established control over Russia's empire, losing only Poland, Finland, and Lithuania. Lenin created what was called the New Economic Policy. You got to know that. Years of warfare, revolution, and mismanagement had ruined the Russian economy. Beginning in 1921, this new economic policy helped to restore production by relaxing government controls and allowing a return of market economies. The policy was regarded as a temporary measure that would be superseded as the Soviet Union built a modern, socialist, industrial economy by extracting resources from the peasants to pay for industrialization. When Lenin died in January of 1924, his associates struggled for power. The two main contenders to replace him were Leon Trotsky and Joseph Stalin. Stalin filled the bureaucracy with his supporters, expelled Trotsky, and forced him to flee the country. Trotsky ended up in Mexico, where he was killed 2 years later. Joseph Stalin succeeded Lenin, and his slogan was socialism in one country. In 1928, Stalin started his first 5-year plan, focusing on rapid industrialization, no matter the human and other costs. Stalin was successful, and within 10 years, the Soviet Union had become the fastest growing industry in the world. In Russia, Allied intervention and civil war extended the fighting for another 3 years beyond the end of World War I. By 1921, the communists had defeated most of their enemies, and in 1922, the Soviet Republic of Ukraine and Russia merged to create the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. Moving on, the collapse of the Ottoman Empire and the rise of Turkey. The Turks had signed a secret alliance with Germany in 1914. As we know, the nickname of the Ottoman Empire was the Sick Man of Europe, and this alliance was meant to help strengthen the Ottoman Empire. The empire had engaged in unsuccessful campaigns against Russia, but this led to the deportation of Armenians, resulting in the deaths of hundreds of thousands during the original deportation. We will talk about the Armenian genocide later on. In 1915, leaders of the Ottoman Empire set in motion a plan to expel and massacre Armenians living in the empire. Most sources agree about 2 million Armenians were living within the empire at the time of this massacre. This would go on until the 1920s. At the end of the war, the Ottoman Empire was at the point of collapse, with French, British, Italian, and Greek forces occupying Constantinople and parts of Anatolia. In 1919, Mustafa Kemal formed a nationalist government and reconquered Anatolia and the area around Constantinople in 1922. Ottoman rule would continue until the empire was defeated in World War I. Constantinople was occupied by the Allies. When the Republic of Turkey was born in 1923, after the War of Independence, Kemal Ataturk moved the capital to the city of Ankara. At the end of this war, the Ottoman Empire collapsed, renamed the Republic of Turkey, and Mustafa Kemal was able to retake Constantinople, renaming it Istanbul. He served as president from 1923 until his death in 1938. His surname, Ataturk, means father of the Turks, and was granted to him in 1934 and is forbidden to any other person by the Turkish parliament. Ataturk was a career military officer in the Ottoman Empire, rising to the rank of general during World War I. Following the empire's defeat and subsequent dissolution, he led the national movement in the Turkish War of Independence, so please make sure you write that down. Having established a provisional government in Ankara, he defeated the forces sent by the Allies, which would lead to the victory of the Turkish War of Independence. Kemal was an outspoken modernizer who declared Turkey to be a secular republic. So he introduced European laws, he replaced the Arabic alphabet with the Latin alphabet, and he attempted to westernize the Turkish family, specifically the roles of women, and even Turkish clothing and headgear. His reforms spread quickly in urban areas, but they encountered strong resistance in the countryside, where Islamic traditions remained strong. Under his leadership, thousands of new schools were built. Primary education was made both free and compulsory, and women were given equal civil and political rights, while the burden of taxation on peasants was reduced. The collapse of the Qing, which would lead to social and economic change. China's defeat and humiliation at the hands of international forces in the Boxer Affair of 1900 led many Chinese students to conclude that China needed a revolution to overthrow the Qing and modernize the country. When a regional army unit mutinied in 1911, Sun Yat-sen's Revolutionary Alliance formed an assembly. Sun was elected as president of China, but in order to avoid a civil war, the presidency was turned over to a powerful general named Yuan Shikai. He rejected democracy and ruled as an autocrat. Sun then turned his attention thereafter to organizing his followers, known as the Kuomintang. The Japanese joined the Allied side in World War I and benefited from an economic boom as the demand for their products rose. Japan used the war as an opportunity to conquer the German colonies in the northern Pacific and on the Chinese coast, and to further extend Japanese influence in China by forcing the Chinese government to accede to many conditions presented in a document called the 21 Demands. In the first decades of the 20th century, China was plagued by rapid population growth, an increasingly unfavorable ratio of population to farmable land, issues with landlords and tax collectors, and frequent and devastating floods of the Yellow River. In Japan, industrialization and economic growth aggravated social tensions between the westernized urbanites and traditionalists, and between the incredibly wealthy zaibatsu class and the poor farmers, who still made up half the population. At the Paris Peace Conference, which is the end of World War I, the great powers allowed Japan to retain control over German enclaves in China. This sparked protests in Beijing and in many other parts of China. China's regional generals, who were the warlords, supported their armies through plunder and arbitrary taxation so that China grew poorer while only the treaty ports prospered. On May 4th, 1919, Chinese university students demonstrated in Beijing to protest Japan's imperialism in what became known as the May 4th movement. Republic of China still faced an imperialist Japan, which controlled areas of Taiwan and Manchuria. The May 4th movement was an anti-imperialist, cultural, and political movement, which, in short, grew out of student protests in Beijing beginning May 4th, 1919. The entire movement in and of itself often refers to the period between 1915 and 1921. Quite often it's been referred to as the New Culture Movement. It is at this time that Yuan Shikai broke with the Republic and tried to establish his own imperial dynasty in 1916. The Guomindang under Sun Yat-sen was rebuilt by both him and his brother-in-law, better known as Chiang Kai-shek. In 1921, a Chinese Communist Party was created in Shanghai. Sun Yat-sen tried to make a comeback in Canton in the 1920s by reorganizing his Guomindang Party along Leninist lines, and by welcoming members of the newly created Chinese Communist Party. Sun's successor, Chiang Kai-shek, crushed the regional warlords in 1927. But Chiang then split with and decimated the Communist Party. He embarked on an ambitious plan of top-down industrial modernization. However, Chiang's government was staffed by corrupt opportunists, not by competent administrators, and China would remain steeped in poverty. When we're talking about the unification and expansion of nations, language is a crucial element in creating a feeling of national unity, but language and citizenship seldom coincide perfectly. The idea of redrawing the boundaries of states to accommodate linguistic, religious, and cultural differences led to the forging of larger states from the many German and Italian principalities, but it threatened to break large multi-ethnic empires like Austria-Hungary into smaller states. Until the 1960s, nationalism was associated with liberalism, as is the case of the Italian liberal nationalist Giuseppe Mazzini. After 1848, conservative political leaders learned how to preserve the social status quo by using public education, universal military service, and colonial conquest to build a sense of national identity that focused loyalty on the state. By the mid-19th century, popular sentiment favored Italian unification. However, it was opposed by Pope Pius IX and Austria. Count Camillo de Cavour, the Prime Minister of Piedmont, Sardinia, used the rivalry between France and Austria to gain the help of France in pushing the Austrians out of northern Italy. In the south, Giuseppe Garibaldi led a revolutionary army in 1816 that defeated the Kingdom of the Two Sicilies. A new Kingdom of Italy was formed in 1860, and in time, Venetia and the Papal States were added to Italy. The unification of Germany. Until the 1860s, the German-speaking people were divided among Prussia, the western half of the Austrian Empire, and numerous smaller states. Prussia took the lead in the movement for the German unity because it had a strong industrial base in the Rhineland, and an army that was equipped with the latest military, transportation, and communications technology. During the reign of Wilhelm I, the Prussian Chancellor Otto von Bismarck achieved the unification of Germany through a combination of diplomacy and the Franco-Prussian War. Victory over France in the Franco-Prussian War completed the unification of Germany, but it resulted in German control over the French provinces of Alsace and Lorraine, and thus a very long-term embitterment between France and Germany. This is important for World War I. International relations revolved around a united Germany, which, under Bismarck's leadership, isolated France and forged a loose coalition with Austria-Hungary and Russia. At home, Bismarck used mass politics and social legislation to gain popular support and to develop a strong sense of national unity and pride among the German people. Wilhelm II, however, would dismiss Bismarck. He initiated a German foreign policy that placed emphasis on the acquisition of colonies. France became a second-rate power in Europe, its population and army being much smaller than those of Germany. Society seemed divided between the monarchist Catholics and Republicans with anti-clerical views. In fact, popular participation in politics, a strong sense of nationhood, and a system of universal education gave the French people a deeper cohesion than actually appeared on the surface. In Britain, a stable government and a narrowing in the disparity of wealth were accompanied by a number of problems. Particularly notable were Irish resentment of English rule, an economy that was lagging behind those of the US and Germany, and an enormous empire that was very expensive to administer and to defend. For most of the 19th century, Britain would pursue a policy of splendid isolation towards Europe. Preoccupation with India led the British to exaggerate the Russian threat to the Ottoman Empire and to Central Asia approaches to India, while they ignored the rise of Germany. So we're going to stop there for today. If you have any questions, send me an email. Thanks for listening, guys. Have a good one. Cheers, y'all.